Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll jump right into it. Today we have Professor Claire Field. She's joining us from the University of Edinburgh. She previously was a postdoctoral research fellow in the AHRC Varieties of Risk project. And she's here today to present on her paper titled, What is Normative Recklessness? Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Brenton. Thanks also for promoting me to a professor, which I am not, but it's fun to pretend. So this paper is called What is Normative Recklessness? It's part of a larger project about how to deal with normative risk. And I'm going to try and suggest that a good way to deal with normative risk is by thinking about normative recklessness. Often in the literature, these two terms have been kind of used interchangeably, but I think we shouldn't do that. They're quite different. And hopefully this is going to give us a way of distinguishing between acceptable normative risk-taking and unacceptable normative risk-taking. I'm going to sort of give you a caveat, though, so that while I think this is a good way to think about normative risk, it's going to end up being a little bit unsatisfying, because my claim in the end is going to be that essentially we can't have a sort of general way of dealing with all normative risk. We actually are going to have to rely more on our first order theories than we might want. Which I think is good news and bad news. What I'm going to emphasize is that we have to rely mostly on our first order epistemic theories, but maybe not necessarily on our first order moral theories, which might be okay if the kind of normative uncertainty we're worried about is moral uncertainty, which it tends to be usually. It's sort of an attempt at a kind of new framework for dealing with normative risk. It's going to be a little bit unsatisfying, but maybe not that unsatisfying. So let's see. Okay, what is, oh no. Okay. Oh yes. Okay, good. Short moment of horror there. Right, so what is normative risk? Essentially, it's the risk of doing something wrong. But specifically, it's the risk of doing something wrong that arises from normative uncertainty as opposed to factual uncertainty. So as an example, of the risk of doing something wrong that would arise from factual uncertainty would be if there's a button and I don't know what it does, but I think it might do something very bad, like killing puppies or setting off a bomb or something. I don't know if it does that, but that's factual uncertainty. So we're not interested in that. We're interested in risks of doing something wrong that arise from normative uncertainty. So if I'm not sure whether killing puppies is wrong, but I know that the button kills puppies, then this is the risk that arises from normative uncertainty. Okay, so you might think, okay, that's a sort of a silly philosopher's example. Do we have any real examples of that? Yes, I think we do. I think we have quite a few. Here is one. Pandemic. So suppose that Angela is the leader of a government and there's a global pandemic and she must decide whether to enforce a lockdown or not. You might think it might be reasonable for her to be equally confident in each of the following two moral views. So the first one says preventing the spread of the virus is the most important thing worth any sacrifice. The second one says preventing the spread of the virus is one of many important things. And many of these other important things would be actually very significantly harmed by an enforced lockdown. Now it seems, pick your favorite. So it seems like it's possible to be reasonably uncertain about which of these two views is true, especially when you have like new problems that are very complex, about which there is lots of disagreement. If you compare how different actual governments dealt with this problem, maybe excluding our own one, because I don't think they can be counted as reasonable, good faith actors. But compare, New Zealand and Sweden, like very different views, possibly reasonable disagreement about what is the right thing to do. There are other examples. Vegetarianism is one that's talked about quite a lot. You might think some difficult medical ethics cases fall into this category. Anyway, how should we deal with cases that are like this, that arise from normative uncertainty? Well, essentially there are a few existing views on how to deal with this. I'm going to oversimplify the debate massively and say that they can all mostly be fit into two two broad camps. And I think both of these two kinds of view face the same problem, so I'll explain that just now. So one kind of view is a sort of broadly decision theoretic approach. And this view basically, starts from the reasonable thought that this is risk, and a good way of dealing with risk is the one that we get from decision theory. Decision theory deals with risk all the time. So why would you? So you might think that this should apply also to normative risk, since this is risk. And then, so this applies the same calculation to all the different options that are available to agents. It multiplies the probability or the credence, it could be, by the value for each option, and then uses this to determine which risks are the ones that are acceptable to take, or rather which actions are the ones that the agent should take. And you can apply different decision rules based on your your views on this. So, for example, you might think you should maximize expected moral value. This is a sort of very risk neutral way of approaching things. You might think you might take a more sort of risk averse line, which is what Lara Buchak does. So she thinks we should, at least when we're making decisions on the basis of someone else, or that will affect someone else, we should use a maximin approach, which is essentially we should aim for the best worst case scenario. So this is a very risk averse approach. I think Alex Guerrero goes for something similar, but he doesn't quite do it in the same way. I think so. So that's, I mean, on this view, all normative risks are treated in the same way, right? Because the same calculation is applied to each one in a very sort of blanket term. So, yeah, I mean, to give you a preview of why I'm worried about this approach, it seems to, so it treats everything in the same way. And that means that we are kind of hostage to what the values are in the particular option. So if we have very sort of, if we're, for example, we have a tiny bit of credence in a very extreme theory, that's going to sort of swamp all other options that we might consider. You might worry that if we're interested in normative recklessness rather than just normative risk, we should be more interested in the, the details of the agent epistemic state. So, okay, so that's one way of thinking about things. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another way of thinking about things is what I'm going to call the right reasons approach. So this sort of, it lies at, I think, the other end of the extreme of views on this topic, and they essentially say that we should not be thinking about normative risk at all. And that's because when we are making decisions, all that should factor into our decision making is what is actually morally important. So not what is possibly morally important, but what is actually morally important. And that's also not what I think is actually morally important. It's what is actually more important way. So it sort of abstracts away from all of the epistemic details of the situation. So, for example, you have Brian Weatherson saying moral recklessness is not wrong. Note he means moral risk taking. He doesn't. I'm not sure he actually means moral recklessness because he doesn't say much more about that. And Elizabeth Harman also, who says that it's irrelevant to our decision making. So, okay, I think with a few exceptions, most of the views on the topic fit into these two camps. And I think the problem with both of them is that neither considers properly the agent epistemic perspective, or why she takes the risk and her attitude for taking the risk. I think maybe in the interest of time, I will skip over the so this is an example of the sort of extreme results you get from the decision theoretic approach if you plug in very extreme values. So this is sort of a version of the typical vegetarian case, but it's not vegetarianism, it's fruitarianism, because maybe carrots are sentient. Anyway, so this is I mean, this is a familiar problem from non-normative risk as well. Obviously, this the decision theory has ways of dealing with this. The reason I'm worried about it in the normative risk case, though, is that it seems really easy to generate cases like this, because all you have to do is do some thinking about some moral views and find them strange and not be completely convinced that they are false, and suddenly you are in a sort of normative risk scenario, which seems worrying. Right? It seems like maybe not how we should do things. Okay, and I mean, I think there were a lot of problems with the right reasons approach. I mean, perhaps the biggest problem is that it seems to be suggesting that we just ignore evidence. We have evidence that we are wrong, and we should not take that seriously. I'm not really sure how it should deal with normative risk cases, because it just says that we should only respond to what is actually important. So I kind of want to leave both of these approaches behind, and I think maybe a better way to proceed is to distinguish between risk and recklessness. So these are different things. There are many ways of defining risk, none of which I'm going to go into. I think a fairly uncontroversial way of defining it is that it's the likelihood of an unwanted event. So, for example, there's a 50% risk of rain, you might say, or a high risk of rain, or low risk of rain, or okay. So, importantly, it is a measurement. So, it's a way of measuring how likely or unlikely unwanted events like rain are. So there's a sort of fact of the matter, you might think, about how risky or not something is. That's quite different from recklessness, which is it's an attitude. So like someone is reckless. I mean, we could maybe talk about acts being reckless, but it's sort of, it doesn't really make sense to talk about events being reckless if there's not an agent involved. So it's something an agent does. It's an attitude that an agent takes towards a risk, and it's blameworthy, right? So it comes with this sort of like this negative evaluation of the risk taking, and I think these two things come apart in a way that also hasn't really been appreciated in the normative risk literature so much. So we can have things that are, so it's possible to have high risks that are not reckless. So you might, for example, accept or choose to undertake a risky medical procedure, which might be risky, but it might not be reckless for you to do that if it's going to save your life and you have no other options. So they come apart in those cases. You might also have low risks that are reckless. So I have this example in the paper where, so suppose you have a big jar of sweets, and just for fun, you like poison one of them and give out, invite your Halloween trick-or-treaters to choose from it, just because you're a weird person and you find that fun. Obviously there's a low risk because there's loads of sweets, but seems like a reckless thing to do because it's not, I mean, why are you doing this? It's hard to imagine a case where it's not reckless to expose children to risks of poisoning. Okay, so they come apart, right? Now, and this is where we move to the legal-ish part of the paper, which is very tenuous. But anyway, so I think the most developed account of recklessness is in the law, because the law is in the business of holding people criminal for acts of recklessness. Well, for acts that are reckless. So there is so this is the motivation for sort of examining the legal concept a bit, and then trying to apply it, which is what we'll be doing next, trying to apply it to the case of normative recklessness and see if it works, and what we should say about it there. So what does the law say? Now I'm aware there are many people who know more about this in the room than I do, so I'm also interested in learning from you guys what you think recklessness is. But I mean, the Model Penal Code says that a person acts recklessly when they consciously disregard a substantial and unjustifiable risk. Similarly, in the UK law, we have the Criminal Damage Act, so someone acts recklessly when they are aware of a risk that will occur, and it's unreasonable to take the risk, which is actually, it's slightly different, but we won't worry too much about the difference there. Importantly, it's a criminal state of mind, so it's distinct from other criminal states of mind, or possibly, so the other ones are knowledge, intention, and negligence, which I think isn't criminal, but it's sort of, except in some cases. Okay, so I think one way of understanding this is to boil it down into it seems to have three components, right? So there's the significance component. It's supposed to be a substantial risk. So it's often said the law does not concern itself with trifles. So it's not interested in like small risks, I guess, or maybe small risks of harm. It's also not interested in risks that are not to things that the law is interested in. So it's interested in risks of harm to people and property and other legally protected things, but it's not interested in I guess, in risks of, I don't know, rain or I don't know, risks I might take of dropping my water bottle on the floor, unless that's going to like hurt someone, but it's not. Okay, there's the epistemic component, so the agent's supposed to be aware of the risk that they're taking, and there's the non-justification component, so it's not justified. All of these need a little bit of unpacking, so that's what is going to happen next. A simple example, so if you're driving at 70 miles an hour in a busy area where the speed limit is 30 miles an hour, for some silly reason, like you're late for your lunch date, then this seems reckless because it meets all of these three components, right? You're harming, there's a risk of significant harm to the people around you. You're presumably aware, and you don't really have a good reason for doing it. Okay, so that's a fairly simple case, but I guess the question I'm interested in is how should we and can we interpret this for normative recklessness? So let's look at the significance component first. So as I said, it's in the law, the risk should be sufficiently high and sufficiently significant harm. So it's for it to be for the criminal to take an interest in it. I think actually the more important thing is that it should be of sufficiently significant harm, because how much justification you need depends on how significant the risk is. Anyway, so this is complicated in the case of normative of recklessness because it's not clear that it is a risk of harm, right? Most cases of normative risk are risks of possible moral disvalue. So if you imagine the typical vegetarian cases, right? So you're not sure whether it's okay to eat meat because you're not sure if it's wrong or not. So you're deciding what to have for dinner. Do you eat meat? Do you eat tofu? If it's in fact fine to eat meat, then there's no risk. This is just not a risky case. So is the significance component met, you might wonder. And so I think what I want to say about this is that we are just going to have to change what it means for something to be a sufficiently significant risk. And I think we're going to have to consider the significance component to be met if it's a risk of like the absence of moral value in general. So not specific things that are valuable. So not like the absence of, I don't know. So whereas sort of Harman and Wellerson want to think about specific things that are morally valuable, I think if we want to take normative recklessness seriously, we've got to think about moral value in general, which I think I am comfortable with, but maybe some people won't be comfortable with. But there's kind of not really a way around that because that's just the nature of the situation. Okay, let's move on. So the epistemic component. Right. So there's different ways of interpreting the epistemic component. Maybe the most kind of natural and obvious way is to take a subjective view of this. So the view that you might interpret it as being awareness or belief that there is a risk. Now, it's important to distinguish that this doesn't have to be an occurrent belief. So it's not like you have to drive down the road at 70 miles per hour thinking, I am risking harm to people, right? Because that would just be too demanding. No one, many cases of recklessness would just not meet that. So, but the idea is that it does have to be somewhere in some form attributable to you as a belief, or at least a mental state. So anyway, there's a lot to say about that, which I'm not going to say. But what I do want to focus on is what Doug Husak said about this. So he's one of the few people in the legal theory literature who actually talks about normative recklessness. So he talks about it in the context of mistakes of law, which are kind of a legal version of normative recklessness, right? Because you're not sure if it's illegal, then is it blamed? There's a sort of question about whether you should be blamed for doing something when you didn't know it was illegal. And he thinks that basically normative recklessness, or recklessness as to whether what you did was illegal, should be treated in roughly the same way as regular recklessness. So he says, blameworthiness is due for doing what you suspect might be contrary to the balance of internalist moral reasons, which is important. So he distinguishes between internalist reasons and externalist reasons. And on his view, it's only the internalist reasons that count, and that should factor into your deliberation. What are they? Well, they are reasons that you recognize as reasons, as opposed to the externalist reasons, which are reasons that you don't recognize as reasons, but might still be reasons. Why is this? Well, he thinks it's because he thinks that we can't expect someone to do something that they cannot do rationally, and that what agents can do rationally is a function of their internalist reasons, and it cannot be rational to act purely on the basis of external reasons. So this would be, I think the idea is that this would be kind of random, like we sort of wouldn't, which kind of makes sense, right? But then there's a worry that I have. Okay, well this is a different worry. Let's do the second worry first. So there's a worry that I have. So what about, reasons that you really should have recognized because they were right there, or because you had evidence that you maybe didn't sufficiently pay attention to, but you nevertheless didn't adopt them as your internal reason. So, for example, what about higher order evidence? So higher order evidence is evidence about your evidence. So it might be, for example, evidence about how reliable you are, how reliable a moral reasoner you are, how reliable a perceiver of the world you are. And you might wonder, well, if you've got higher order evidence that the things you think are the moral reasons are actually not the moral reasons, or like you think you might be unreliable on the matter of morality, which does seem to be the situation that people who are facing normative uncertainty are in, right? They're uncertain, so they don't think that they are infallible about the moral truth. Seems like they have higher order evidence, but I'm not sure it's overly helpful to talk about internal and external reasons, because they have the reasons that they recognize. I mean, so suppose I'm a meat eater who is uncertain that it's okay to eat meat, right? I mean, in fact, I was one of these people for many years, and now I think about normative recklessness, so I'm a vegetarian. But for a long time, I thought, well, there were the reasons that I think support eating meat, and I realized that many friends I have don't share them. So it seems like I have this evidence that maybe I'm not fully reliable, and I'm not sure. It seems like the subjective, you can't really account for that fully. I mean, I would say it seems problematic to be ignoring this higher order evidence about your reliability. Is it reckless? I mean, if you have Doug Husack's view, you can't say that this is reckless. They just, these people would just not meet the epistemic component. But again, it does seem to sort of meet the same kind of it does seem to sort of have the same kind of blameworthy attitude to risk if you just ignore evidence that you are unreliable and continue to act on your own view. As a comparison, so I mean, this also seems to be kind of different to how we would think about recklessness in the law. So in the law, when defendants are evaluated as reckless or not, the law fixes which risks are considered important, and they're not taken to be fixed by the agent's opinions about what things are important, right? We don't normally consider what people actually thought was important. I mean, well, at least not most of the time, unless there's some kind of special epistemic consideration. But at least most of the time, we sort of think that it's okay to fix what is important. So you might wonder, why is this different for normative recklessness? Okay, so I'm not sure. So for this reason, this sort of high order evidence worry makes you worry about the subjective view. Maybe we could have a more objective view then. Well, what about Anti-Duck's view? So he thinks that recklessness is to be characterized by practical indifference, and you can be practically indifferent to a risk, i.e., you can act in a way that manifests indifference to it, even if you're not aware of it. So this is quite a different approach, and it allows us. I think it would allow us to count the kinds of agents I was just talking about within the realm of of people who are reckless. So it would allow them to beat the epistemic component. And what matters is sort of how this indifference underpins the agent's action, basically. So he suggests that we ask questions like, is the action explained by the agent's indifference, and would she act differently if she had been aware of the risk? Okay, so this might give us a way to sort of capture or have people with high order evidence about their reliability meet the epistemic component. Again, there are some worries though. So one worry that people have raised about this is how should we distinguish this from total obliviousness to risk? So suppose I'm walking along a cliff and I just have no idea that there's a big drop there, and there's no way I could have known, and there's lots of mist or something, perhaps. Yeah, how would, I mean, is this practical indifference? I mean, it's not, you might think to be indifferent to something, you have to have some awareness of it, right? Otherwise you're just, it might be weird to say that you're indifferent. I mean, being indifferent is saying that you don't care sufficiently, but how can you care sufficiently about something that you have no idea about? So it's a little bit unclear how to explain that without bringing awareness back in, but he precisely doesn't think that we need to be awareness of a risk. So this I'm not sure about this either. Or rather, I think the way that we'd want to develop this in a way that made sense, and that made this distinction that I think it's useful to make, would be in a more kind of evidential direction. So I think this, I mean, perhaps this is a better way to go. What if we say that risk is contrary to moral reasons that the agent is in an epistemic position to recognize? Now, I want to leave that really broad about what in an epistemic position to recognize could mean. But basically, whatever your favorite first order epistemic theory says puts you in an epistemic position to recognize, that's what this should mean, I think. Well, perhaps not your favorite one, but the true one. Yeah, and I think this is another kind of reason that Husserl's taxonomy of reasons missed out. So he basically had the internal reasons that you accept as your reasons, and then the external reasons that you are reasons, but you don't know about them, or you don't think they're reasons. And there's a third category, right? So reasons that are reasons, and they're not your internal reasons, but there's a sense in which you epistemically should have recognized them. So maybe like you just didn't, had you done a little bit more thinking, you would have come to recognize them. Perhaps it's that I think it's sort of maybe easier to sort of imagine cases of this if we imagine professional context. So like imagine you're a doctor and you didn't read the thing you should have read about the latest medical developments. That gives you, and you could have done it. It wouldn't have been overly difficult. You just didn't. It seems that you should have. There's a sense in which you should have known some things that you didn't know. We might also think of it in more kind of, I guess, more epistemic terms. So suppose you actually believe all of the evidence that supports a conclusion. You just haven't like drawn the conclusion. I mean, you've got the evidence there. You just sort of didn't make the connection. So I don't know. I mean, should this be how to understand the epistemic component? I mean, it would include the people who have high order evidence about their reliability, but just kind of ignore it. Of course, you might be worrying that, like, I mean, maybe there isn't enough of the awareness component in this. I mean, wasn't recklessness supposed to be about an attitude? I mean, can we really count this as an attitude that somebody has towards risk? You might worry about that. You might worry that this is negligence rather than recklessness. And I'm actually not sure what I think about that. And yeah, I mean, that's the worry that I have, because on the one hand, this seems to be, I mean, it seems to be important to count people who sort of, gratuitously ignore their evidence about their reliability as taking problematic normative risks. But if we insist that they have to be aware of the risk, it seems like we can't do that. Yeah, so you might worry that actually this is negligence, and I guess maybe I might want to say, well, maybe that's fine. I mean, I'm talking about moral theory rather than criminal law, so maybe that's okay. Anyway, not sure what I think about that. We can talk about that later. Okay, the final one. I think probably the trickiest one, right? The non-justification component. How should we understand that? So, as far as I can tell, in the law, risks seem to be justified by their social value. So this is what legal textbooks say. For example, they say that risks are justified when they bring about moral social value. Now, I'm going to confess that I find this kind of confusing, so maybe lawyers in the room can just help me with this, but like, I don't know what that means, but I suppose maybe that's part of the virtue of it, in that it's sort of left to be specified by whatever society your law is operating in. So an example that I found was, well, the surgery, right, that's risky, but it has social value, so it's justified. And there's Russian roulette, that's risky too, but it doesn't have social value because we don't like people playing Russian roulette, so that's not justified. And then it just seems to be fixed by, I guess, what the society values or doesn't value. Okay, so this obviously won't work for normative risks, at least not moral normative risks. What should we use instead? Could we use moral value? If so, is this actual or subjective moral value, or something else? Well, we could, I mean, I take it that in the law we are talking about actual social value, like what is actually socially valuable according to the society. So maybe we want to do that in this case too, in which case it would be what is actually morally valuable. And you might think this works in some cases. So suppose suppose you're an agent in one of the vegetarianism examples. You're worried about whether you're uncertain about whether it's okay to eat meat or not, but there's something else that's at stake that's just much more important. So you're like a diplomat at a state dinner, and everyone's going to be really offended if you don't eat the meat. They're going to start a war. It's going to be terrible. So there we might think, well, this other huge moral disvalue just justifies you taking the risk in this case. Okay, you might think though that that's all very well in that case, but part of what's at work in that case is also the agent's attitude. So the agent knows all of this stuff and has the relevant beliefs about what is morally disvaluable, but we're supposed to be evaluating the mental attitudes of agents taking risks, particularly in cases where they're uncertain about what is morally valuable. So does it make any sense to appeal to actual moral value when it comes to justifying risks? I'm not really sure. Obviously, whether our beliefs about morality are true depends on factors outside our mental attitudes. So you might think this just isn't really appropriate in the normative uncertainty cases because we're not, what justifies your risk will then be something that is just totally outside of your epistemic ken, which might seem kind of strange if what we're looking for is a blameworthy attitude towards risk. Like, it seems like people are going to be reckless or not depending on things that they have no idea about in some cases. So that seems that I think that probably won't work. Okay, maybe we could go with what is subjectively morally valuable. Again, that also has a problem. It seems like that's going to make meeting the non-justification component just too easy. So, if we think that what justifies you taking a risk is that you believe that it's more morally valuable, then that your risk is just going to be kind of justified depending on what you believe. So whatever you believe is morally right, that's going to be justified. And so that sort of erases the whole problem of moral uncertainty. We don't need to think about it. I mean, this in decision theory, this is my favorite theory approach. So you just go with whatever your favorite theory is, I think, on this view, at least. Yeah. So that, I think that's not massively helpful either. Okay. There's another sort of sub problem of this, and that's that different normative theories generate different views of how to deal with risk taking. So this is a point that Chelsea Rosenthal makes. There's actually so these questions of how to justify normative risk are moral questions, right? So this is first order moral issue. So should we? How should that factor in? Should I also take my own view of how to justify risk and use that to evaluate whether the risk I'm taking is reckless or not? that just seems, doesn't seem to work, right? That's going to get very complicated very quickly and not really give us any way of dealing with the phenomenon of normative uncertainty. So that's not going to work. Okay, so predictably, given the things I've said and the fact that I told you I was an epistemologist, I think that it is justified by what is perspectively morally valuable. So basically, I think the evidence is important. That's really just the main point of this talk. The evidence is important, and none of these views think the evidence is important, and that's a problem. So I think it's not what you believe. It's not what actually is, but it should be what the evidence available in your situation suggests is morally valuable. Now, again, then we're going to need a view of what the evidence supports, and how you should actually sort of take your evidence into account when you're deliberating. But I think that's the that is just how it is. And I guess I leave that to sort of the other epistemologists to figure that out. So here's an attempt at sort of stating that. I think it's probably not perfect, but it's something like this, right? So S is justified in taking the risk if, according to the reasons that according to S's evidence could be reasons, taking the risk is sufficiently likely to bring about most moral value. Okay, so that's different from what you believe would bring about most moral value, right? Okay, so just a quick summary then of what I just said. So I think Recklessness offers us a kind of a new way of understanding normative risk that is different from the existing ways. And there's three components that I've just sort of given you an overview of. There's some more stuff about how to apply this to moral ignorance and some objections, but I've now talked for a long time, so I think I'm just going to stop here, and we can talk about those if people want to. So thank you.